remember that grainy news footage? With the terrified little boy caught in the middle of a political firestorm. It felt like the whole country was split in half over this. That was Elian Gonzalez. And his story is even more complicated and fascinating than you might remember.
What gets me about this case is it really reveals so much about U.S.-Cuban relations and the media, how much power it has to shape the story, and the human stories that get lost when things get political.
It's a deep dive into a moment that many of you listening probably actually lived through.
Yeah, you probably remember this.
It all starts in 1999. Elian, he was just 6 years old. He escapes Cuba with his mother and her boyfriend. They're risking everything, crammed into this tiny, rickety boat for a chance at a new life.
And this was when the U.S. had that wet foot, dry foot policy for Cuban refugees. Basically, if you made it to U.S. soil, you could stay. But if you were caught at sea, you were usually sent back.
So when the boat capsizes in a storm, it's a really violent storm, and Elian is found clinging to an inner tube, rescued by 2 American fishermen.
It becomes an international incident.
It does, because according to the rules, he should have been returned to Cuba.
Right.
But the fishermen knew about the policy and insisted on bringing him to shore in Florida.
And that just sets the stage for this huge legal and political battle that pretty much consumes the nation.
Elian ends up with relatives in Miami, in Little Havana, a community that is very, very much opposed to Fidel Castro's regime. And his father, back in Cuba, who was a devoted communist, wants his son back.
Yeah.
Can you imagine the emotional turmoil on both sides of this?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it goes very quickly from a custody dispute into a political battleground. The Miami relatives file for asylum for Elian, arguing that sending him back would be like condemning him to this horrible life of oppression under Castro. But Elian, he wasn't fleeing political persecution. He was 5.
Right.
He didn't choose this journey. He was with his mom, who was driven by her hopes for a better future for him.
And that's a distinction that was often lost in all the craziness.
In the media frenzy.
Yes.
It was crazy. He was everywhere, all over TV, the newspapers, magazine covers. He became a symbol in this much larger game.
Yeah.
There were these staged photo ops at Disney World with the Miami relatives. Interviews that were carefully orchestrated by them, even made up stories about dolphins protecting him from sharks during his ordeal at sea.
Oh my gosh.
It felt like they were really trying to craft a narrative, making him the poster child for Cuban exiles.
And it worked. The media ate it up, both in the U.S. and internationally. It played into all the Cold War anxieties, right? And this fear of communism, this American desire for, like, a feel-good story amidst all this political turmoil.
Right.
It's a crazy example of how easily we are all manipulated by these emotional stories, especially when there's a kid involved.
Speaking of manipulation, let's not forget about the political heavyweights who saw opportunity in all of this. Fidel Castro himself used Elian's case, portraying him as a victim that was kidnapped by the U.S.
He did.
Staged huge rallies in Cuba, denouncing America, calling for Elian's immediate return. He even used it to go after dissidents within Cuba, further solidifying his own power. And then on the U.S. side, the Republican Party, those who had their eyes on the 2000 election, saw Elian as a way to really get the Cuban-American vote in Florida. They were holding congressional hearings denouncing Castro and even tried to pass a law giving Elian U.S. citizenship, which is highly unusual. It was a political strategy. By siding with the Miami relatives and framing the issue as, freedom versus communist tyranny, they were really appealing to the anxieties and aspirations of the Cuban-American community.
And it put Al Gore in a really tough spot. He was the Democratic candidate at the time, trying to appeal to those same voters while also criticizing the Cuban government.
It was quite the tightrope walk.
It was. So while this legal battle is dragging on over Elian's custody, public opinion in the U.S. is divided.
It was.
I mean, the polls showed that most Americans thought he should go back to his dad. But in Miami, the Cuban-American community, they were totally against it.
It wasn't just about laws and treaties. It was emotions, family and really deep political beliefs.
Yeah.
It felt like a powder keg.
It was a very tense situation.
Yeah.
And in April of 2000, Attorney General Janet Reno, she was under pressure to figure this thing out. So she brings Elian's father to the U.S., hoping to reunite them and send them back to Cuba.
But the Miami relatives, they really didn't trust Reno, did they?
No, they didn't, especially after Waco and Ruby Ridge.
Yeah.
You know those incidents, they made people suspicious of the feds, and the Miami relatives were afraid Elian would be taken from them by force.
So how did all this distrust play into what happened next?
Well, it made everything super tense and volatile.
Yeah.
Reno's people, they tried to negotiate with the Miami relatives, promising a compromise. Maybe Elian could stay in the U.S. if his father agreed. But the relatives thought it was a trick
Oh,
to
wow.
get Elian back to Cuba, so they refused to budge.
I remember all those protests outside the house, people chanting and waving Cuban flags.
It was intense, and behind the scenes, things were about to get really crazy. Reno's negotiators, they kept the Miami relatives talking all night. But federal agents were getting ready nearby, preparing to raid the house.
Wait a minute, so they were negotiating but knowing all along they were going to use force.
Seems that way. At about 4:30 a.m., just as the sun was coming up, Reno's team asked for a 5-minute break from the negotiations, and suddenly, heavily armed federal agents storm the house. They break down the door and start using tear gas.
It was chaos. I remember that picture of a terrified Elian with Donato del Rempel, one of the fishermen who rescued him, just staring into the barrel of a federal agent's rifle.
Oh yeah, that image won a Pulitzer Prize. It really captured the terror and confusion of that whole thing. And you know what's crazy? The photographer who took that picture, he knew about the raid ahead of time.
Oh, wow.
He was inside the house before the agents even got there.
That's wild. The media was all over this story, like a reality show in real time.
Exactly. And the raid was really controversial. People protested in Miami and all over the country. The Cuban-American community felt completely betrayed. They thought it was the Clinton administration using its power against them.
But it was criticized in the media, too, wasn't it? Even by people who supported Elian going back to his father.
It was. A lot of people thought it was too much force, especially against a kid. And in such a dramatic way, it felt like the government went too far.
So what about the political fallout? I mean, this had to hurt the Democrats, right?
It's complicated. The raid was unpopular, but the backlash was mostly in the English language media. The Spanish language media, the ones serving the Cuban-American community in Miami, well, they saw it as a direct attack on their community.
It made them feel alienated from the Democrats.
Exactly. And that feeling had a big impact politically, especially in Florida. Remember, it's a swing state. And in the 2000 election, the Cuban-American vote in Miami-Dade County, which had been mostly Democrat, it shifted a lot towards the Republicans after the raid.
So even though the raid was unpopular overall, it might have actually helped the Republicans by getting Cuban Americans to vote for them.
It's one way to look at it.
Wow. It's incredible how this one event, this moment of drama, could have had such a huge ripple effect to maybe even changing the outcome of a presidential election.
It's true. And the impact went way beyond the election. It changed Florida politics for years. It made the Republicans stronger on immigration. And it just made things worse between the U.S. and Cuba.
So in the end, Elian goes back to Cuba with his father ending the crisis. But the story doesn't really end there, does it?
Not at all. He basically becomes a symbol for Castro's regime.
Yeah.
His image was everywhere promoting the revolution and criticizing America. His 7th birthday party was even on national TV with Castro himself there. Elian was a huge symbol.
That must have been so strange for a kid to be in the middle of all that pressure and attention. His whole childhood basically taken over by things he couldn't control.
Absolutely.
He was one symbol in the U.S. and a totally different one in Cuba.
That's a good point. And it shows how powerful stories are, how they shape how we see things, even when those stories are, like, super simplified or made up.
Like all that stuff about the dolphins protecting him at sea?
Yeah.
Come on, that sounds like a movie.
Total movie. But people ate it up.
Because they wanted to believe it fit the story they liked.
Exactly. It was like divine intervention.
Yeah.
Right. Elian's meant for something special. Good story, even if it wasn't true.
So what about Elian after he went back to Cuba? Did he turn into this, like, brainwashed communist, like some people said?
It's not that straightforward. He did grow up very sheltered around people who worshipped Castro. They saw Elian as, like, national pride. He joined the Young Communist Union, gave speeches, and even studied to be an industrial engineer, which is, like, super important for Cuba's economy.
But isn't that proof he was brainwashed?
Well, hold on. Elian has said himself that he chose his own path, that he supports the Cuban government. Now, is that really how he feels, or is it because of how he grew up, living in that kind of system? We can't know for sure.
Makes you think, what if he'd stayed in the U.S.? Maybe he'd be a doctor or a lawyer. Who knows?
Right.
Would he have been happy? Or would he have felt this pressure to be, like, the symbol of Cuban exiles?
That's a big question.
It's sad in so many ways. Not just his mom dying, but how this whole thing tore families apart, caused political fights, and in the end, everyone felt betrayed.
Yeah. Even those 2 fishermen, Donato del Rempel and Sam Ciancio, the ones who rescued Elian, They had a falling out over where he should live. Their friendship couldn't survive all this political stuff.
It's like a reminder that even personal stories get caught up in these big historical moments. They become these battlegrounds for different ideas and political stuff.
It is.
And the media plays a big role. Making things simple, giving some people a voice, silencing others, it all adds to how divided we are today.
Yeah.
So after this whole deep dive into Elian Gonzalez, what have we learned? What can we take away for our own lives?
Well, I think it makes us think harder about what we read and hear. Question the stories we're told. Try to see things from different sides. Be careful about emotional stuff, especially when kids are involved.
It also reminds us that history isn't just dates and events. It's about people. Real people with real feelings, caught up in stuff they can't control.
Yeah.
And maybe the biggest thing is to try to see things from everyone's point of view, even if we don't agree with them.
I like that.
It's a powerful takeaway. The Elian Gonzalez story might be over, but it makes us think about family, identity, politics, and how the media influences us. And those are just as important today as they were back then.
Definitely. If this got you interested, you should check out the You're Wrong About podcast. They go even deeper into this crazy case. It shows that to understand what's happening today, you got to understand history, even the messy parts.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep finding those stories that make you think and understand the world better.